Welcome to this roundtable discussion on issues important to the understanding of political economy. Our participants from top to bottom: John Adams, Mortimer Adler, Charles Beard, Jacob Bernowski, Winston Churchill, Will Durant, John Kenneth Galbraith, Henry George, John Locke, Karl Marx, George Bernard Shaw, Adam Smith, and Frederick Jackson Turner. We will begin our discussion by asking Henry George about his long quest to reconstruct political economy into an objective, scientific discipline. Man masters material nature by studying her laws, and in conditions and powers that seem most forbidding, has already found his richest storehouses and most powerful servants. The domain of law is not confined to physical nature. It just as certainly embraces the mental and moral universe, and social growth and social life have their laws as fixed as those of matter and of motion. Would we make social life healthy and happy, we must discover those laws and seek our ends in accordance with them. As a contemporary of Mr. George, perhaps Karl Marx will provide a rather different perspective on the need to bring man-made law into conformance with that of natural law. I believe that even when a society has got upon the right track for the discovery of the natural laws of its movement, it can neither clear by bold leaps, nor remove by legal enactments the obstacles offered by the successive phases of a normal development, but it can shorten and lessen the birth pangs. Is there then a conflict between the apparent lessons of history and what Henry George and Karl Marx see as natural laws governing the organization of human societies? I recognize Mortimer Adler to respond. What is new in the world today and distinctive of our time is the conflict between those who think that where our institutions are defective, the defects can be removed by institutional changes of one sort or another, and those who despair of institutional change itself, and who turn in their desperation to non-institutional means of reaching the promised land of a better day. Non-institutional means, Dr. Adler. I am referring to revolutionary violence. Is the violent overthrow of a society's long-standing laws and institutions morally justifiable, given the loss of life that always occurs? I see that Jacob Bernowski would like to comment. That Jefferson, like Locke, was very serious about the right of revolution is supported by his comment that the tree of liberty needs to be watered by the blood of patriots from time to time. Mr. Shaw, I am sure you have something to add to further enlighten us. Jefferson's perspective aside, heroic aspirations, devoted services, dauntless bravery, unsparing bloodshed are worse than useless when the combatants understand neither what is wrong nor how to set it right. Of course, the perspectives held by a Jefferson, who enjoyed a life characterized by a unique combination of privilege, property, and individual liberty, must differ from those of, say, Karl Marx. Is that not correct, Herr Marx? Such misunderstanding is nearly universal. That bourgeois society in the United States of the mid-19th century was not yet developed far enough to make the class struggle obvious and comprehensible was most strikingly proved by Henry Carey, the only American economist of importance. All he proved was that he took the undeveloped social conditions of the United States to be normal social conditions. And yet, when Henry George was writing, these signs were certainly evident. Does the history of uprisings against those who hold power reveal an explosion of dissent against economic deprivation, against political oppression, or both? I recognize Jacob Bernowski. Emperors go, but empires remain, and as Karl Marx might agree, neither he nor Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto created the revolutions in Europe, but they gave them the voice. It was the voice of insurrection. Is that not so, Herr Marx? Where the working class is not yet far enough advanced in its organization to undertake a decisive campaign against the political power of the ruling classes, it must at any rate be trained for this by continual agitation against and a hostile attitude toward the policies of the ruling classes. Otherwise, it remains a plaything in their hands. But many modern societies have embraced the principles of social democracy. John Galbraith has documented this history in his writings. Professor Galbraith, would you care to elaborate? The revolutionary uprising you embraced had obvious points of vulnerability. There was the threat posed to it by reform, the possibility that the hardships of capitalism would be so mitigated that they would no longer arouse the revolutionary anger of the workers. Liberal reformers in the 20th century were in step with much of the Communist Manifesto. Do you concur, Mr. George? Neither the liberal reformers nor those who embrace the perspectives offered by Herr Marx allow themselves to see that his analysis is materially flawed because he fails to properly distinguish between ownership classes, which are productive and therefore advance the progress of society, and those which are non-productive. By its very nature, ownership of capital must involve production in order to generate new wealth. Ownership of land, on the other hand, requires no such ownership activity, only the growth of the community. Mr. George, some have characterized your program to collect the rent of land for public purposes as socialistic. I wonder whether George Bernard Shaw, who credits hearing you speak with turning him into a social activist, agrees. Mr. George does not see that if the state confiscated rent without being prepared to employ it instantly as capital and industry, production would cease and the country be starved. My own reading of Henry George indicates he makes a strong distinction between the role of the community versus that of the state. His reform is best left in the hands of the members of each community, as this makes sense. What many people have come to fear is the power of corporations. Mr. Durant, I see you would like to join this conversation. I do not relish the control of economic lives by vast corporations. To keep the benefits and check the power of these mastodons, I would favor public ownership of natural resources, including the land and all its minerals, fuels, and other subsoil wealth. Such proposals are not new, of course. Herr Marx and other communists and socialists have argued this case repeatedly. Herr Marx? Long before the period of modern industry, cooperation, and the concentration of the instruments of labor in the hands of a few gave rise to great, sudden, and forcible revolutions in the modes of production, and consequentially in the conditions of existence and the means of employment of the rural populations. I suspect most of us here acknowledge how changes in land use, from subsistence food production to commercial agricultural and resource extraction, were fostered by the land monopoly described by Henry George and, of course, Adam Smith. Do you challenge the historical record? I concede to Mr. George that this contest at first took place more between the large and the small landed proprietors than between capital and wage labor. On the other hand, when the laborers are displaced by the instruments of labor, by sheep, horses, etc., in this case force is directly resorted to in the first instance as the prelude to the Industrial Revolution. The laborers are first driven from the land. Land grabbing on a great scale is the first step and creating a field for the establishment of agriculture on a great scale. We cannot turn back the clock to a time before the great enclosures of the commons and the removal of so many millions of peasants from the land. Mr. George, what would you have us do? I do not propose either to purchase or to confiscate private property in land. The first would be unjust, the second needless. Let the individuals who now hold it still retain possession of what they are pleased to call their land. Let them buy and sell and bequeath and devise it. We may safely leave them the shell if we take the kernel. It is not necessary to confiscate land, it is only necessary to confiscate rent. I take much of this analysis from our great predecessors, Smith, Turgot, and Patrick Edward Dove. I see that Adam Smith, who has sat patient and quiet to this point, would like to respond. As soon as the land of any country has all become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed, and demand a rent even for its natural produce, the wood of the forest, the grass of the field, and all the natural fruits of the earth, which, when land was in common, cost the laborer only the trouble of gathering them, come even to him to have an additional price fixed upon them. He must give up to the landlord a portion of what his labor either collects or produces. That, Mr. Smith, is certainly what has occurred throughout much of history. Mr. George, for one, challenges the very foundation of law that permits this confiscation and redistribution of wealth from producers to a non-producing rentier elite. Is he correct, Mr. Locke? Where the land is concerned, we must identify the moral principles attached to our occupancy and use. God, who hath given the world to men in common, hath also given them reason to make use of it to the best advantage of life and convenience. The earth and all that is therein is given to men for the support and comfort of their being. Rarely, however, has this moral principle served as our guide for our systems of law. Even in the case of North America, the principle you established, that individuals are entitled to claim land so long as much of equal value remains available to all others, proved to be short-lived. The land of North America, almost from the beginning of European settlement, was held by a small number of privileged aristocratic families. Do you not agree, Mr. Adams? I too believe that property in the soil is the natural foundation of power and authority. If the lands are held and owned by the people and prevented from drifting into one or a few hands, the true power will rest with the people, and that government will essentially be a democracy, whatever it may be called. Under such a constitution, the people will constitute the state. The vast unsettled territory allowed those who occupied North America to envision a future of universal opportunity, to be sure. Of course, those who crossed the ocean from Britain were escaping from a land where privilege was deeply entrenched. Is that not how you see the situation, Mr. Shaw? Very much so. As long as there is plenty of land for everybody, private property and land works very well. But this state of things never lasts long with a growing population, because at last all the land gets taken up, and there is none left for the later comers. Mr. Churchill once described our history very similarly. Quite right, Mr. Shaw. Mr. Churchill, during your early political life in league with the Liberals, you displayed a keen understanding of the problems caused by landed privilege. Remind us of how you saw the issues, if you would. It does not matter where you look or what examples you select. You will see that every form of enterprise, every step in material progress is only undertaken after the land monopolist has skimmed the cream off for himself. And everywhere today, the man or the public body that wishes to put land to its highest use is forced to pay a preliminary fine in land values to the man who is putting it to an inferior use, and in some cases to no use at all. All comes back to the land value. and its owner for the time being is able to levy his toll upon all other forms of wealth and upon every form of industry. Somehow this arrangement has become accepted and even defended by those who are left out of the economic system. Is it the case, Mr. George, that the majority of people hope they too can get in the game and become wealthy by speculation in land? The long-term effects are best illustrated by the constant existence of speculation where private ownership has been protected by the governing authority. Essentially, the influence of speculation in land in increasing rent is a great fact which cannot be ignored in any complete theory of the description of wealth in progressive countries. It is the force, evolved by material progress, which tends constantly to increase rent in a greater ratio than progress increases production, and thus constantly tends, as material progress goes on and productive power increases, to reduce wages, not relatively, but absolutely. And yet, Mr. George, a combination of many factors has improved the living standards for every new generation, despite the concentrated control over land and the existence of land speculation. Still, you are certain this cannot continue. What has destroyed every previous civilization has been the tendency to the unequal distribution of wealth and power. This same tendency, operating with increasing force, is observable in our civilization today, showing itself in every progressive community, and with greater intensity the more progressive the community. Surely George Bernard Shaw appreciates this insight. Even long before this happens, the best land is all taken up, and later comers find that they can do as well by paying rent for the use of the best land as by owning poorer land themselves, the amount of rent being the difference between the yield of the poorer land and the better. At this point, the owners of the best land can let their land, stop working, and live on the rent. That is, on the labor of others, or as they call it, by owning. And of course, in the process creating an ever more powerful and destructive rentier class. Other than a societal collection of rent, is there any other measure to counter this inevitability? Mr. Locke, remind us again of the moral principle you see as governing our claim to land. I have argued that as much land as a man tills, plants, improves, cultivates, and can use the product of, so much is his property. He by his labor does, as it were, enclose it from the common. Such private enclosure is limited to conditions where there is still enough and as good left, and more than the yet unprovided could use. Had this proviso been adopted in North America, the future of its citizenry might have been characterized by less conflict and greater harmony. Do you not agree, Mr. Adams? The balance of power in a society accompanies the balance of property in land. The only possible way, then, of preserving the balance of power on the side of equal liberty and public virtue is to make the acquisition of land easy to every member of society, to make a division of land into small quantities, so that the multitude may be possessed of landed estates. If the multitude is possessed of the balance of real estate, the multitude will take care of the liberty, virtue, and interest of the multitude in all acts of government. That sounds very much like what Thomas Jefferson wrote early on by his vision of a society of self-reliant farmers working the land. Was Jefferson unrealistic, Mr. George? It seems to me that those who look upon the small farmers of the United States as forming an impregnable bulwark to private property and land very much miscalculate. Time has shown this to be true, Mr. George, as the number of family-owned farms has dwindled in many countries. At the same time, agriculture is widely subsidized by price supports and tariffs on imports. Even so, technology has replaced large numbers of farm workers who migrate to the cities to compete for employment there. No society has been able to fully employ its citizens. Is the monopoly of land the primary reason? This strange and unnatural spectacle of large numbers of willing men who cannot find employment is enough to suggest the true cause to whosoever can think consecutively. Is it not the fact that labor is thus shut off from nature, which can alone explain the state of things that compels men to stand idle, who would willingly supply their wants by their labor? Mr. George, your fundamental dogma is that everything would be all right if ground rent were paid to the state. This is a frank expression of the hatred the industrial capitalist dedicates to the landed proprietor, who seems to him a useless and superfluous element in the general total of bourgeois production. We ourselves adopted this appropriation of ground rent by the state among numerous other transitional measures, which, as we also remarked in the manifesto, are and must be contradictory in themselves. Well, Henry George challenges your assessment by arguing that the system we think of as capitalism can be reconstructed on the base of a fulfilled promise of individual liberty, one that ensures equality of opportunity. Mr. Shaw, why did you align with Herr Marx's conclusions rather than those of Mr. George? I had no difficulty in showing that even if the largest construction was placed on George's propaganda so as to make his single tax a tax on the rents of capital and ability as well as land, the socialization of these rents by means of the single tax would involve the socialization of industry, for which there was no provision whatsoever in George's scheme. In fact, the single tax was advocated by capitalists who opposed socialism and who saw the advantage to themselves of diverting attention and taxation from their own enormous gains to those of the landlord. Except as a stepping stone to socialism, Mr. George's single tax propaganda is a waste of time. As a Fabian, Mr. Shaw, you still hold faith in democratic processes and institutions, as does Mortimer J. Adler, whose proposals for achieving a more humane type of capitalism have found a degree of support from employers and their employees. Can the problem be solved? I think it can. With every technological advance, the increasing productiveness of capital instruments also makes the solution of the problem more feasible. That solution is based on principles of economic justice which not only respect property rights, but also recognize that each person has a natural human right to participate in the production of wealth through the ownership and application of productive property to a degree sufficient to earn for that person a decent standard of living. Yet you must agree that even with the creation of employee stock ownership plans, we have not even slowed the power of rentier interest to control the sources of what we all need in order to live. There has been only very limited progress toward the form of universal capitalism you and Louis Kelso campaigned for. I think that Henry George would say your proposals fall short of the real objective. Mr. George? We single taxers point to the one sufficient cause. Wherever these phenomena are to be seen, the natural element on which and from which all men must live, if they are to live at all, is the property not of the whole people, but of the few. We point to the adequate cure, the restoration to all men of their natural rights in the soil, the assurance to every child as it comes into the world of the enjoyment of its natural heritage, the right to live, the right to work, the right to enjoy the fruits of its work. Rights necessarily conditioned upon the equal right to that element which is the basis of production, that element which is indispensable to human life, that element which is the standing place, the storehouse, the reservoir of men, that element from which all that is physical in man is drawn. Until we can discover some way of making something out of nothing, there is no possible discovery or invention which can lessen the dependence of labor upon land. And this being the case, the effect of these labor-saving devices, land being the private property of some, would simply be to increase the proportion of the wealth produced that landowners could demand for the use of their land. This is certainly demonstrated in today's property markets. In some of the major cities around the world, the land cost can exceed 50% or more of a residence. The dynamic is not new, of course, as even wage workers have managed to become landowners, landlords, and speculators, as I know Herr Marx can attest to. We should note that the capitalized rent, the price of land, now becomes an important aspect, and that not only can the former rent payer transform himself in this way into an independent peasant proprietor, but also urban and other holders of money can buy plots of land with a view to leasing them either to peasants or to capitalists and enjoy the rent on their capital, thus invested as a form of interest. Yes, many of us see investment in land as just one of many ways of securing income. We lease land to actual farmers. We construct buildings offering space for lease to residential or commercial tenants. We might even lease land to someone else to construct a building charging ground rent. And very few of us recognize this as destructive to our communities, as does Mr. George. If one man owned all the land accessible to any community, he would, of course, demand any price or condition for its use that he saw fit. And as long as his ownership was acknowledged, the other members of the community would have but death or emigration as the alternative to submission to his terms. This has been the case in many communities, but in the modern form of society, the land is in the hands of too many different persons to permit the price which can be obtained for its use to be fixed by mere caprice or desire. So, the market does work to some degree, if imperfect and with serious negative consequences. While this may continue to be the case for land owned for home ownership, we observe today an ongoing concentrated control over natural resource-laden lands by corporate interests. As Frederick Jackson Turner will attest, even with the population of the United States still rather low, the ideal of free land and the frontier opportunity had already disappeared by the end of the 19th century. The American frontier is sharply distinguished from the European frontier, a fortified boundary line running through dense populations. The most significant thing about the American frontier is that it lies at the hither edge of free land. In the settlement of America, we have to observe how European life entered the continent and how America modified that life and reacted on Europe. Who shall measure the effect on Europe of free land in America? America has given occasion for a new migration of the peoples comparable to the older one. Of course, one of history's most studied migrations is that of the people of Ireland to the far corners of the globe. I see Professor Galbraith asking to be recognized. Ricardian landlords were also amply present in Ireland, or more often absent in England, which was socially much more congenial and frequently also a safer place for a landlord to live. As the Irish population expanded, so did the competition for land, and so did the return that was extracted by the absentee landlords. Grain was grown to pay the rent, potatoes were grown to feed the people. Even when people starved, the grain was sold and the rent was paid. And in many parts of the world today, people are starving even as agricultural land is reallocated to grow crops for export markets. Mr. George, you toured Ireland extensively and tried to build support for your proposals there. What are your thoughts on the Irish land question? To drop a man in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and tell him he is at liberty to walk ashore would not be more bitter irony than to place a man where all the land is appropriated as the property of other people and to tell him that he is a free man, at liberty to work for himself and to enjoy his own earnings. That is the situation in which our Irishman and a worker nearly everywhere finds himself. Yes, to be landless in an agrarian society is to live a short and brutish life. This is certainly borne out by history. Would you not agree, Mr. Durant? We may derive endless instruction from the economic analysis of the past. We observe that the invading barbarians found Rome weak because the agricultural population, which had formerly supplied the legions with hardy and patriotic warriors fighting for land, had been replaced by slaves laboring listlessly on vast farms owned by one man or a few. Are the lessons to be learned by how the land was settled in North America different from those of the Old World of Europe or Asia? When we consider the public domain from the point of view of the sale and disposal of the public lands of the United States, the story is in sharp contrast with the European system of scientific administration. Efforts to make this domain a source of revenue and to withhold it from emigrants in order that settlement might be compact were in vain. Perhaps Mr. Beard has additional thoughts on the matter. As population increased along the Atlantic coast, speculation in western lands was one of the leading activities of capitalists. Large areas had been bought outright for a few cents an acre and were being held for a rise in value. The chief obstacle in the way of the rapid appreciation of these lands was the weakness of the national government, which prevented the complete subjugation of the Indians, the destruction of old Indian claims, and the orderly settlement of the frontier. Most important during the period of settlement of America has been the fact that an area of free land was continually laying on the western border of the settled area. Whenever social conditions tended to crystallize in the east, whenever capital tended to press upon labor there, was this gate of escape to the free conditions of the frontier. When did this situation begin to disappear? Mr. Galbraith? Until the Civil War, and even after, what distinguished the American scene was a spacious abundance, a prospect of income and opportunity for farmer and worker, as well as businessman and capitalist, unimaginable in England or on the continent. If the worker could at any moment express his dissatisfaction by deserting to the frontier, there was not much foundation for a theory of wages. If farmers could own and farm their own land, there was no need for a theory of rent. So, a serious examination of political economy had to wait until land became a scarce commodity. What would account for the intense speculation in land by every generation of Europeans who set forth in North America? Mr. George? In communities like the United States, where the user of land generally prefers, if he can, to own it, and where there is a great extent of land to overrun, speculation operates with enormous power. I feel certain that Frederick Jackson Turner's research confirms this. It is a proposition too plain to require elucidation, wrote Richard Rush, Secretary of the Treasury, in his report of 1827, quote, that the creation of capital is retarded rather than accelerated by the diffusion of a thin population over a great surface of soil, unquote. 30 years before Rush wrote these words, Albert Gallatin declared in Congress that, quote, if the cause of the happiness of this country were examined into, it would be found to arise as much from the great plenty of land in proportion to the inhabitants which their citizens enjoyed as from the wisdom of their political institutions, unquote. Clearly then, the advantage people had in the United States was as much the opportunity to acquire land at affordable prices as the rule of law. We had for our public domain the best part of an immense continent. It had been our boast that here everyone who wished it could have a farm. We have not merely common schools, but high schools and universities, open to all who may choose to attend. Yet here the same social difficulties apparent on the other side of the Atlantic appeared. It is clear that our democracy is a vain pretense, our make-believe of equality, a sham and a fraud. The relative equality of Americans before 1776 has been overwhelmed by 1,000 forms of physical, mental, and economic differentiation, so that the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest is now greater than at any time since imperial plutocratic Rome. Yet within the mainstream of political dialogue, the discussion rarely, if ever, gives serious treatment to the issues we have raised here today relating to land and resources provided to us by nature. We do tax land to some extent, but at a far lower level than its full rental value. What about us, Mr. Shaw, causes us to favor land ownership above other assets and rent above wages? Unfortunately, the ordinary man is an anarchist. He wants to do as he likes. He may want his neighbor to be governed, but he himself doesn't want to be governed. He loathes tax collectors. This anarchism has been at work in the world since the beginnings of civilization. Perhaps Henry George has a different view on the nature of our species. I believe a civilization is possible in which all could be civilized, but it must be a civilization based on justice and acknowledging the equal rights of all to natural opportunities. Well, gentlemen, we have reached the end of our allotted time together. I thank you for your insightful contributions to this discussion. We have perhaps renewed an ancient but essential dialogue on the foundations of political economy.